Hello, everyone. It's 12:45, so I am going to welcome you to this event today. This event is called Women in Politics, Then and Now. My name is Dr. Leanne Westman. I'm the director of the Honors College at Rutgers-Camden, and I'm your moderator for this terrific panel discussion of women in voting. We're glad you're here. First, I want to thank the co-sponsors for this event, the Alice Paul Institute, the Honors College at Rutgers-Camden, and the Departments of History and Gender Studies at Rutgers-Camden. We've been talking about this event since last year, wondering how to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gave all women the vote, but we never imagined that it would be a virtual event on Zoom. In fact, we had so many ideas that didn't include a virtual event. And we wish, of course, that we could be with you in person. But nevertheless, we're happy to meet with you in this format today. And with our first female vice president in history, the timing seems quite good. It's both wonderful and sad that we elected Kamala Harris as VP this fall. Wonderful because it's a great way to commemorate 100 years of women's suffrage, but of course sad because it took 100 years before we had this first female candidate at such a high level. I'm going to begin by introducing you to our panelists. Each one of them will talk for about 10 minutes about women in politics, and then we'll welcome your comments and questions. Feel free to use the chat to post questions or comments, or to use the Q&A function. We'll be monitoring both of those. And then if you feel shy about speaking on Zoom, I'm happy to pull your question off the chat or the Q&A and ask it for you. So our four panelists, who you can see, are Dr. Nicole Bellawin, Lucy Beard, Dr. Kelly Dittmar, and Tanya Martinez. I want to tell you a little bit about their background, and then I'll turn the time over to Dr. Bellawin, who will go first. And so speaking of her, she's a public historian in residence at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Center for the Humanities at Rutgers-Camden. You might know that by its acronym, MARCH. She's the co-editor there of The Public Historian and the digital media editor, both for the National Council on Public History, and at Rutgers, she directs a continuing education program in historic preservation. She's also a fascinating historian on the history of material culture, the material culture of disability in early America. And I told her that's something I'd love to hear a lot more about. Lucy Beard is the executive director of the Alice Paul Institute. You'll see she's got her background actually references Alice Paul, and she's responsible for the preservation and interpretation of Alice Paul's home, Paulsdale, which is a National Historic Landmark in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. Paulsdale tells the story of the long struggle for women's voting rights and legal equality in America. And it also serves as a base for the Institute's leadership, development, and advocacy training program for teen girls. She holds a master's degree in American history from Rutgers-Camden and a bachelor's in international relations from George Washington University. Dr. Kelly Dittmar is an associate professor of political science at Rutgers University Camden and director of research at the Center for American Women in Politics at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. If you read any newspapers or watch any news the past month, you might have seen her because she's frequently consulted to talk about issues related to female candidates and women in politics. Her research focuses on gender and American political institutions. And finally, I'm really happy to welcome Tanya Martinez, who is also a member of the Honors College and president of the College Democrats, and a junior who has been an advocate for the immigrant community since she was 15 years old and helped to was one of the founding members of the Rutgers-Camden College Democrats. So I will turn the time over to Dr. Bellawin, who's going to go first, and then she'll be followed by Lucy Beard, and then Dr. Dittmar, and finally by Tanya Martinez to talk about the issues related to women in politics. So I turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Leanne. Someone give me a thumbs up so I know that you can all hear. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today, even though we're remote. I'm going to give you a really big overview of where the right to vote for women is part of the broader history of women's roles in private and public life in the United States. And I'm going to offer some ways that you can learn more about this history from the comfort and safety of your own home to inspire action in your own community. Throughout the talk, I'm going to put a couple resources in the chat, so keep an eye out for that in case you want to explore some of the things that I'm talking about. Now, when we talk about women's suffrage or woman's suffrage, WOMAN, as it was known historically, usually we mean the right to vote in political elections. Great example, the presidential election that we just had. In the US, women were granted this right nationally in 1920, about 144 years after the colonies declared independence from Great Britain, and they were granted this right in 1920 with the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. This, of course, was part of a long debate about the role of women in society. Should women own property? Should women work outside the home? What kind of work was appropriate, is appropriate? What did femininity encompass? Some anti-suffrage ephemera or advertisements from the 20th century suggested that getting the right to vote would make women less ladylike. And I'll show you, put something in the chat to get to start looking at some of these ideas. Are women equal to men? Remembrances circulated after the recent death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg reminded us of some of the ways that Justice Ginsburg changed women's lives and contributed to these discussions. For example, news outlets widely reported that she was particularly pleased with the Supreme Court requirement that the Virginia Military Institute, a state-run college, admit women. They could not deny women entrance on the basis of sex, and this was a 1996 ruling. These questions are endless. The discussion is ongoing. And today, of course, we have broader discussions now to talk about equality for all gender identities, not just equality for women and men. We can understand how we want to contribute to this discussion, I think, by learning more about its history. So the question of suffrage, about whether women could or should be seen as independent or independent from their male father or husband as political thinkers, was actually kind of hotly debated in the past. It's maybe less so today, but this idea about whether women should be able to exercise their role as independent thinkers through the vote was not just assumed to be the way things should be. There are many significant events that led up to the passage of the 19th Amendment in the US. But there were also things that women did every day in their private and public lives to expand their voice and their role in America. So what I'm going to do now is highlight some of those big events that we usually associate with the suffrage movement, but also talk a little bit about some of those smaller ways or smaller contributions that women were making every day. One great example, before the American Revolution, which happened in 1776, some women, for example, chose not to marry so that they could maintain some legal rights that men had, like control over their own property. One landmark publication we often talk about is Mary Wollstonecraft's 1792 publication, The Vindication of Rights of Women. And in that publication, she popularized the term women's rights. Now, you might know that there's a new statue up dedicated to her that has garnered some controversy. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I encourage you to take a Google later. Another way that women expanded their roles over time, we often look to the Quaker community, this religious sect, to talk a bit about that. Quakers tend to, still today, believe that men and women were equal in the eyes of God, and they extended this to the way that they governed their church and their community. And as a result of this, many Quaker women were involved in the suffrage movement. Another important way that women in the United States tried to work against what were some of the ways that people thought that they should be acting, Black enslaved women were constantly running away from their enslavers and practicing other forms of resistance, thereby asserting their rejection of their role as chattel slaves. Another really important event is the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 that took place in New York. And that tends to be cited as what represents the nationalization of the movement for women to get the right to vote. And in that meeting, they came out of that with something called the Declaration of Sentiments. And in that declaration, they noted that all men and women are created equal. And this, of course, differs from the Declaration, which says that all men are created equal. It's important to remember that the suffrage movement was not unified. There were many different voices and ways to go about it. And that's something that's common to all sorts of political initiatives today. Another landmark move to think about are the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which outlawed slavery, made slaves citizens, and gave them the right to vote after the Civil War. Many women involved in the suffrage movement were also involved in the abolition movement. But it's important to remember that some women working for suffrage did not believe in giving Black individuals the right to vote. So for some people, suffrage was a racist movement. There's a new book out. It's either out now or will be very soon. That's all about, I just put it into the chat, how some women were trying to create a really inclusive suffrage movement that didn't just include the big names that we tend to think about today when we talk about the history of suffrage. So if you want to learn more about how diverse this movement really was, it looks like this book is going to be a great contribution to that discussion. Another important thing to keep in mind, in the late 19th century, lots of women were expanding their roles in society by helping out communities, by helping out immigrant communities with healthcare and education, especially in cities like Chicago. The Hull House, you might have heard of, established in 1889, is a great example of this. And then, of course, we have the passage of the 19th Amendment itself in 1920. But as I'm sure many of you know, this did not conclude the discussion of what women's role should be in public and private life. It's easy to forget that this amendment limited and left out, either in practice or by law, African American women, Native American women, and others. So for example, in 1965, the United States passed the Voting Rights Act. They had to do this because African Americans and Native Americans continued to face exclusion from voting through mechanisms like poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation. Access to voting continues to be an issue today. My area of expertise, as Leanne mentioned, is disability history, and there were several stories in the media about in this past election related to disabled people getting access to the vote. It was a particular concern this time around because of the pandemic. It wouldn't necessarily be safe for certain disabled people to vote in person, and it wasn't always easy to get a ballot at home, depending on where you lived. And to give you another example, if a blind person wanted to go to the polls, it would be really difficult for them to maintain, or maybe not really difficult, but it would be a different experience for them to have to maintain social distance safely. So if you're interested in learning more about some of these big milestones, or even some of the other bits of history that I mentioned earlier, I would definitely recommend that you take a look at some of the ways historians have been commemorating these stories. Many of these things you can access online, and in other cases, you can go visit museums and historic sites in person if it's safe and if they're open. So for example, there have been dozens of online exhibitions. One of my favorite was created by Harvard. I'm putting it in the chat now. It brings together lots of resources from a variety of institutions and puts them all in one place. So you can take a look at primary sources, items made in the time period, to think more about how this history unfolded over time. The National Park Service also has a very comprehensive, it's a little more dry website that you could take a look at as well. And I would also encourage you to ask around in your own town and neighborhood. I'm sure there are many historical societies that are doing either online programming or maybe outdoor things related to commemorating the passage of the amendment also. For example, the Museum of the American Revolution, which just had to close, but there's still content online, has an exhibition up now called When Women Lost the Vote, which refers to the 30 years between 1776 and 1807, when the New Jersey state constitution allowed white women and Black women to vote if they met a property requirement. Interestingly, some of the promotion of the 19th Amendment drew on early American imagery referencing the so-called New Jersey exception, and I'll put some of that in the chat for you to take a look at too. So, and of course, there's Alice Paul's house, which I'm sure Lucy will talk more about in a moment, but one of those really cool local historic treasures that you can explore either virtually or perhaps in person. So the debate about women's role in society in the US goes back to before the founding. Uh, the debate about the right roles for people who identify with a range of genders continues today. Barriers remain. Where do you stand on those issues? Don't just let this anniversary pass you by, learn more about it. And I put some of those resources in here so that you could do so. And I'm sure we'll learn more about some other options for learning about what you can do in your own community from our other panelists. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Bololan. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat or just hold off to the end and we'll entertain all of them. I'm going to turn the time over now to Lucy Beard from the Alice Paul Institute.
Thanks, Leanne. Thanks everyone for having me. And yes, I do get paid to talk about the Alice Paul Institute, so I better earn my pay today. I think you'll notice behind me that alicepaul.org is our website. We have also, because I know I'm talking to largely probably a South Jersey crowd, we've been very active co-chairing the statewide commemoration of the 19th Amendment and this 100th anniversary. And there is a website for that. It's discovernjhistory.org. And on that website, there's a couple different statewide initiatives, but one of them is New Jersey Women Vote, the 19th Amendment at 100. So I would want to share that with all of you. Again, thanks for having me today. I'm going to try to share my screen. We're going to see how this goes. My Wi-Fi broke down right as I was about to get on this call. So I feel like I'm on tenterhooks. Can you all see that? Yes, all right. Okay, well then we'll give it okay, there we go. All right, so this is Alice Paul, born in Mount Laurel, New Jersey on August 18th, 1920. She was in Washington, D.C., and she had just gotten word that the 19th Amendment had just been ratified by the 36th state, Tennessee, where it was basically put across the finish line by one man changing his vote in the state house. But I'm not going to talk about him. He gets way too much attention, if you ask me. They were the 36th state, not the first. And here she is, she's posing for a publicity shot in front of the ratification banner. And she had been using this shot for publicity throughout the ratification process, the 14 months. Every time another state would ratify the amendment, she would call the press over to watch her sewing another star on the ratification banner. I'm fairly sure it's the only sewing she ever did. But that's a taste of the kind of publicity and marketing and branding that these women were very good at. We tend today to look back at the suffragists and think of them as sort of polite little ladies. That's really not an accurate picture, particularly of Alice Paul and her group. These women were forward thinking and considered quite radical at their time. She had been, as I said, working on this banner for 14 months. And as soon as after that publicity shot was taken on August 18th, she then sat down and gave an extensive interview to a reporter from the Washington Times, a newspaper, an evening newspaper in Washington at the time. And the next day, that interview was recorded verbatim in the paper underneath the banner headline about women winning the right to vote and Tennessee putting them over the finish line. And there were various subheadings about goody, you'll see here, goody, goody, gurgle the ladies, and glorious victory, says Mrs. Catt. But what does Alice Paul say? She says, the fight for all rights is still facing women. They're not done. The vote's only the very first step in women's political progress. So it was very typical of her to take this stance rather than one as celebratory as the other women. On the next page, the continuation page, the big headline says, neither political party should be thanked for this. The women won it, not the political parties. They owed no debt to the Republicans or the Democrats for winning the right to vote. And as I said, she makes the case in this article that the vote is just the start, that women must think of themselves as a political bloc and should vote in their own interests, and not just follow the parties. And that is why she was the chairman at this time of her own organization, which was called the National Woman's Party. It was not an association, it was a party. And the idea was that it represented women who already had the vote. In the states west of the Mississippi, when she got involved in the movement, there were already 10 states where women did have the vote. So the National Woman's Party was formed to represent those women as a bloc, a voting bloc. It was not unusual for Alice Paul to go her own way, to take a different route from the rest of the suffrage movement. Since she had joined it in 1911 and really made her first mark on the national stage, she had been employing tactics that were not used in America. She brought them back. She had learned them while in England from 1907 to 1910. English tactics like street corner speeches. This is her colleague in crime at this time, Lucy Burns, out on the street making a speech. Keeping anything they could do to keep suffrage and the issue of women's voting rights in the public eye. They created the first large-scale parade in support of women's voting rights through the streets of Washington. And they selected the date for that parade very specifically, the day before Woodrow Wilson would be inaugurated as president, March 4th, 1913. Thousands of women and men marched through the streets of Washington demanding, not asking for, but demanding the right to vote. They kept the issue in the public eye through magazines and publications, newspaper articles, any tactic they could use. They wanted people to be thinking and talking about the issue of women's voting rights. And through the 19-teens, as world events took precedence, things like World War I, the National Woman's Party took a more active role than any of the other women's organizations in literally taking their cause to the streets. And they did something that had never been done up until this time, because Alice Paul believed very strongly that you hold the party in power responsible for whatever is going on, and that you always take your argument to the top. So when the president President Wilson was distracted by the start of World War I and would no longer discuss the issue of women's voting rights, they decided to take their argument to his front door. And as I said, this had not been done before. They picketed in front of the White House day in, day out throughout the year in 1917. And eventually, for that picketing, they were arrested. In the summer of 1917, I think it's about 168, I'll say, women were sent to jail, all on the charge of obstructing traffic on the sidewalks in front of the White House. But they were in jail for their political beliefs, not for obstructing traffic. This is Lucy Burns, Alice Paul's partner in this endeavor and co-chair of the National Woman's Party, in jail. Lucy Burns spent more time in jail for the suffrage cause than any other woman in America or England. The jails, the workhouses, and even the mental asylums around Washington, D.C. were filled with these suffragists. Some of them would have terms to serve of 3 days, some as long as 3 months. When Alice Paul was arrested in October 1917, she was given 7 months solitary confinement in a psychopathic ward of this DC City jail. The women went on hunger strike, and starting in the fall of 1917, they were force-fed in order to keep them alive, but also to intimidate them. In November of 1917, they were released. Nothing was working, nothing was making them stop this campaign. And they continued this campaign through 1918 and until the 19th Amendment was passed out of Congress and then out to the states for ratification. They staged public demonstrations in Lafayette Park across from the White House, burning Woodrow Wilson's speeches in a cauldron, literally burning his words as he was making the world safe for democracy. This was incredibly radical for the times, and it was very unpopular with a lot of people in the movement, but they understood that the need to get the word out and keep it in front of the public eye throughout. That was always the cornerstone of their campaign. During the ratification process, the National Woman's Party continued all of their activism. There was no dialing it back. But once it was ratified, most of the suffragists packed their bags. They went home. The war was over, except for the National Woman's Party. Alice Paul then turned. She wanted to reform the party to continue the fight for women's equality. Now that they had the vote, as she said in that newspaper article, they had a say in their democracy, but they were still not in any other way on an equal footing with men. And she turned the National Woman's Party efforts in that direction, so that by 1923, this is her kneeling at Susan B. Anthony's grave, the day that she made the public announcement of an equal rights amendment, a new constitutional amendment that would guarantee equality regardless of your sex. The Equal Rights Amendment was introduced into Congress in 1923 and was considered in every session following that until it finally passed out of Congress in 1972. But it was not ratified by the required 38 states. It is still a constitutional amendment in need of ratification. It's not part of our Constitution. And that is where she focused the rest of her life until her death in 1977. And that's one of the many things that the Alice Paul Institute is continuing in her honor. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Lucy. So many great things that both Nicole and Lucy gave us to think about with the history. I'm going to turn the time over to Dr. Dittmeyer. Again, if you have questions or comments, put them in the chat or write them down and save them for the end, because we'd love to hear from you. Go ahead, Dr. Dittmer.
Well, thank you all, and thanks for coming. I know you guys have a lot of Zoom offerings, and so we appreciate that folks are here and interested in this topic. So the 19th Amendment is symbolic in the way that it addresses women's formal political rights more overtly than had ever been done before, and on the national scale until that point in US history. But of course, we know that women's political participation, including office holding, begins well before 1920. We know, for example, that nearly 70 women served as state legislators between 1894 and 1919, mostly in Western states. To the best of our knowledge, the first woman mayor was in Argonia, Kansas in 1887. The first woman elected to statewide executive office was in North Dakota in 1892. And we even had an all-woman town council in Kanab, Utah in 1912. Perhaps most notably, of course, Jeannette Rankin became the first woman elected to the US Congress in 1916, serving in the House from 1917 to 1919, and then again later from 1941 to 1943. All of this is just to note, before I get into where we are today, that just as it was with voting, there was progress in women's political empowerment happening for candidates and office holders before the suffrage amendment passed. So really just putting that context around it. Like with the story of women voters, the progress for women candidates and office holders after 1920 was not at all swift and certainly incomplete and exclusionary, which you've heard already. The discussion, particularly exclusion for Black women, for Native American women, the fact that this has not been 100 years of the exercise of the right to vote. And that's true as well when we think about access to our political institutions in terms of representation. So for context, 50 years after Jeannette Rankin was first elected to the US House in 1976, just 19 women served in Congress. So this gets to the slow progress we saw. And of course, it was only 14 years before that, in 1962, that the first woman of color, Patsy Mink, was elected to Congress. 6 years later, in 1968, Shirley Chisholm became the first Black woman elected to Congress. And it wasn't until 1989 that Ileana Ros-Lehtinen became the first Latina in Congress. And for those of you who paid close attention in 2018, of course, that was the first time that we elected Native American women to the US Congress. And additional context, in the US Senate, we have only ever elected 5 women of color to that level of office, with the first Black woman not elected until 1992. So I'm sure many of you already know these facts, but I do think it's a good reminder to put into this timeline of US political history for women alongside changes in women's voting rights and participation. So now I want to kind of give a sense of where we are at, where we've been and where we're at today, especially in light of the recent election. Of course, the expansion of women's influence and participation as voters from the Voting Rights Act and since 1980 is not in isolation from women's expanded representation as candidates and office holders across those different periods. Certainly, women don't win office simply due to women voters, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But there is a role to play in inclusion across our institutions. So we've seen more women participate as donors, more women run for office, as well as exercise their right to vote in both independent and very influential ways. And again, we saw that just a few weeks ago. Despite the progress that women have made in elections and office holding over the past 40 years, they remain underrepresented at every level, both in the candidate pool and among elected officials. Today, women are less than 30% of office holders at every level. You can see this on this line chart, and that will not change in 2021. So this gives you a sense, this is as of this week. These numbers will continue to change because mail-in voting really slows down our counts, but it's good because folks had access. But you can see the changes that we're gonna see, at least as of today, in women's representation. So yes, we will see a record level of women in the US Congress, but we will be up to 26.4%. Remember, women are over 50% of the population. And you can see this across levels. And of course, we'll actually probably see a decline in the US Senate, although that is in part because we will have our first woman vice president. And so we lose the only Black woman in the Senate right now. We will lose, unfortunately, but we will, of course, gain a woman at this highest level of office who is breaking a glass ceiling that we have never seen broken before. In terms of candidacies, where were women at? Well, in this year's election, they were less than 30% of candidates, less than 40% of nominees, those who got on general election ballots. And you can see that here, just to see where they were again in 2018 versus now. So again, progress to a certain level in terms of overall candidates for the US House. And nominees for the US House. The Senate story is a little more complicated. We're not seeing steady increases over time, and this has been a challenge in terms of women's representation at the highest levels of American politics. And despite this, we've continued to see a partisan gap. So women are more likely to be office holders representing the Democratic Party than they are the Republican Party. This gap that I'm showing you here is in candidacies, but this also then persists again into office holding. What's interesting about 2020 is that we've seen this year Republican women fare very well comparatively to previous years and even to Democratic women. So while the gains for women in office in 2018 were entirely on the Democratic side, in fact, Republican women had lost representation. For example, in the US House, they went from just 23 members, and remember there's 435, to just 13. In this election, however, they were a record number of candidates, a record number of nominees, and will be a record number of office holders. They are also the majority of non-incumbent women winners. This is a really hard slide to see, but all I really want you to see is the blue and the red. And so you can see that what that is the makeup of the new women who will serve in the next US House. 17 of them will be Republicans, only 9 of them will be Democrats, and add to this that 5 Democratic women incumbents lost their seats. So in terms of bringing the partisan gap, which I show you here, right, you see this gap in which there are more Democratic women in office than Republican women. Once I add the next Congress, you'll see this go down a little bit. That is not to say, of course, that Democratic women won't still be the majority of women in office. They will, by a significant amount, and also that Democratic women will continue to be better represented within their party. As of today, there are about between 40 and 41% of the Democratic caucus in the next House. Republican women, if all things ended today, would be about 13% of all Republicans in the next House. So that disparity and that underrepresentation for Republican women will continue, but we have seen particularly them fare well in terms of the progress in Republican women's representation this year, and therefore, potentially over time. And one thing that we always know at the Center for American Women in Politics is if our goal is parity, you can't get to parity, or it'd be very hard to get to parity on only one side of the aisle. And so if that is the goal, that this is a good sign that there are more Republican women running and winning. I also, though, want to be acknowledge that beyond partisan differences, we also have to look at racial and ethnic disparities in terms of representation. This is just one set of information. Just to remind you that while a record number of Black, Latina, Asian or Pacific Islander, and Native American women ran for Congress this year, again, we're nominees, and we will have a record number of Black, Latina, and Asian American women who will serve in the next Congress. We know this already. That as of today, 26 states have still never sent a woman of color to Congress. 27 states have never sent a woman of color to the US House. 46 states have never sent a woman of color to the US Senate. And before I noted that 5 women of color have ever served in the US Senate, here's the comparison. 69 white men currently serve in the US Senate, right? So you have to look at these things in terms of, yes, progress made, but also the progress we have left to make, and the fact that especially for women of color who've been on the front lines of so many of our movements to enhance women's rights and enhance civil rights, are still really facing a recent history of access to political power, not only through the vote, but also in elected office. And so I will stop there, but just to note that we will also have a record number of women of color in the next Congress. But again, those numbers, women, broadly speaking, as well as women of color, will continue to be underrepresented as a portion of the population. So we have a lot more work to do, and I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Dittmar. That again, I hope you're writing down your questions. I'm writing down mine, and I'll turn the time over now to Tanya Martinez, who is president of the College Democrats.
Hi, everyone. I just want to say, first off, how grateful I am to be on this panel. I'm really excited. So how I really wanted to approach this is because I am just a student, as all of you are, and we all come from the same, growing up and, and whatnot. And so I wanted to give you all a bit of what our then and now is, giving it that context. So for us, we all grew up and we would put on our backpacks and our parents would take us to school and we would go and we would learn about history. And when we learned about history, a lot of the times, all of the people in power we were learning about were men. A lot of the time, that's what we were hearing. And that's a lot of the time what we were seeing. We would go home, we would watch with our, at least I would watch a lot of political commentary from with my brothers or whatnot. They were being spoken about by men in terms of the Late Show, where we had Jon Stewart, we had Stephen Colbert, but all of them were men that were talking. And then they were talking about men in power. And we were just constantly seeing and constantly hearing how men are power, and we were equating that in our heads without even realizing it. And so I think it's important to put in that context of how we grew up. And then we would watch shows and we'd watch movies with our parents that were action. And what we would see again is only men had this power to save the world. It was this idea that only men really have that. And it's so frustrating now to reflect on how that my mindset was so shaped by that. And so I think putting that context and how we grew up and how we were educated and what we learned is really important to know why it is now that a lot of people feel intimidated to run for power, and why a lot of people feel intimidated to even think about people being represented in terms of my voice mattering. And so one thing I wanted to bring up is how, again, going back to me being in school, one thing that really did impact me a lot is having a lot of friends that were essentially also Latina like me, and the way that we viewed student council. And I think it's a really good representation of how this transfers to politics later. But when we looked at student council, it was normally white people running. It was normally white people, and it was very, very few women that were white that were like actually running for student council. And what we would tell each other is like, oh, like it's just like a white thing. That's what they want to do. That they're gonna pick themselves. They're gonna pick like whatever. And I'd hear that, and I wanted to run, but I was really shy. I didn't know how to start, and I also felt like they were right. Like they're just gonna pick the people that they want. They're gonna be talking about how they can empower themselves. They're going to be talking about how like, oh, we want this for ourselves. They talk to their friends. And I think that translates very well to what we see now in terms of politics. We tend to think, especially people that are of color, people that are indigenous, that they're only going to be picking people that they want. They're only going to be doing their own agenda. They're not looking out for us. And so we see some people running, which is awesome, that are of color, that are women, and they're going to be able to talk a lot more with and engage with conversations. And so I think it's a good thing that we're progressing, but we're not progressing enough. So I'm actually from Arkansas. I'm an out-of-state student. And one thing that really impacted me in high school was I was invited to a country club meeting, and I was excited to go. I was gonna be able to talk with them about, our community or whatnot. But when I went, every single person was white and every single person was a male. And I felt so out of place. I was like, am I in the right room? Like, I don't think I am. I was so confused, but they were all just talking about our community. But, like my voice, I wasn't allowed to talk during the meeting, but I wasn't hearing anything about the immigrant community. We have a huge immigrant community, and we weren't hearing any of that. And so seeing that for me made me want to get a lot more involved. And so whenever I got into activism at 15, I joined the Arkansas Immigration Community Coalition, and I saw so many more women, especially people that looked like me, and they were able to empower me on how to be powerful, how to use my voice. And so we're seeing a lot more of that in terms of what we're seeing in terms of like movies, what we're seeing in terms of people in power. And so what I really want to like emphasize is how much social media has affected us. And so now that we're a lot older, we understand all of the factors involved and how women do have more power. But I do want to point out how much social media has really impacted that, but then also a lot of the times like our conversations that we're having. And so one example that I really wanted to point out, because I love the Avengers, but Avengers Endgame had this one scene where it was all women that were fighting against Thanos, who was the big villain. And there was this one scene where they were rescuing like everyone. And I thought that was really empowering, because we were able to see, again, women in power. So we're starting to see more conversations like that, but I don't think there is enough. There isn't a lot of Latino representation in media and whatnot. And so, another really important factor is after 2016, a lot of people were very frustrated with everything going on, with the fact that we had someone in office that was talking about women like they were objects. And as a result, no one cared. I mean, the way that he spoke was so frustrating, that we saw in 2018 for that election, a lot more people of color, a lot more women running. And that's when we had the squad form, which has like AOC, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, and then Rashida Tlaib. And I think that those four individuals have been really great for the Gen Z community in terms of what is it that power looks like, and how do we step into these positions of power. And so I think in specific, TikTok has been really great in terms of empowering women, but specifically after AOC was verbally assaulted by a representative outside of Capitol Hill, her response empowered women. And I want to showcase a video of that from a TikTok trend that happened. And this trend essentially had women dress up in however they wanted to and represent themselves. And what we saw was this go viral. And so I wanted to go ahead and showcase that to all of you.
Nobody pray for me. It been a day for me. Yeah.
Representative Yoho put his finger in my face. He called me disgusting. He called me crazy. He called me out of my mind. He called me dangerous. Representative Yoho called me, and I quote, a fucking bitch. I am here because I have to show my parents that I am their daughter, and that they did not raise me to accept abuse from men.
So when I first saw that, when I was just scrolling through TikTok, that to me spoke volumes, because it was the fact that, a lot of the time when we get told things, when we're assaulted and we don't even realize it, we don't know how to respond. We don't even know what to say, what to do. And so having someone in power who had this happen to them, and having such a great response, and then also showcasing how she still remains with her dignity and her power, that meant and spoke volumes. And so I think doing things like that in terms of, you as an individual, doing things where you're outspoken and you're speaking about your experiences, speaking about why it is that you should not be pushed around. It's really important. And I think it's important to be outspoken in the way that she is. I know that oftentimes growing up, I would hear things like, oh, like you seem angry, you're talking about politics, and like, are you like on your period? And I would get so angry because it's just a way to devalue me, devalue what I'm saying. And I would hear that way too often. And so I think it's important to have conversations why that's wrong and why it is that that's something that needs to be addressed. And so I guess that's like my challenge to all of you is how can you be implementing more so of, taking into account the fact that we have this history of oppression, this history of individuals that are trying to push us down. How can we respond to that? How can we best craft a response that is going to be able to influence and create change and hopefully inspire others in the way that AOC inspired us. So yeah, I think that's essentially what I challenge all of you to do. And there is a lot of great work that all of you can get involved in. I know that on our campus, we have a lot of organizations that do a lot involving, empowering your voice. And I think at the end of the day, that's all we can all do.
Thank you to all 4 of our panelists. I have questions and I have things I want to follow up on, but I want to give you an opportunity to ask questions as well. There's a way to put your hand up. I'm sure you know how it works. Or if you want to put something in the chat. But I'm happy to start this discussion while you put your questions in. In fact, I really would like to just take off from Tanya's remarks. I think Tanya pointed out 2 things which pulls this whole panel together. One is that when women speak up, they are belittled or they're mocked. In fact, I was going to go back and ask Nicole to talk about when women lost the vote in New Jersey. It was pretty common to mock men who got what was called the petticoat vote. Like there was something shameful about women voting for you. But there's a long history of belittling women historically and in the present for speaking up. And so, and of course, this functions to silence all women, right? That you see someone speak that way to AOC and think, well, boy, if they talk to her like that, what are they going to say to me, right? So what advice do you have, anybody on the panel, and what have women done historically to manage the efforts to silence them, either by mocking them or by imprisoning them or by referring to their votes as something trivial or silly? And I'll invite any of the panelists to jump in and to address that question. Because I imagine there's some strategies from history that we can learn from, including what AOC did, which was terrific, to stand up in Congress and say, this happened to me and this is my response.
I mean, I would just say, first, I would just want to commend Tanya because she's doing that, right? Like, so the fact that you're sharing not only just more broadly calling on others to be active, especially among your own generation, but also saying, here's my experience and here's how I'm going to counter these biases. One of the things that I think is really important is the women who do get into positions of power, you have the bully pulpit, you have some access, is to call out the biases that you faced. And historically, some women in power have been reluctant to do that, right? Because they've said, look, I just got here. I'm not going to play the gender card. I'm not going to play a race card, because they've been attacked on that. The moment that AOC, not only herself, but was followed by a group of women, mostly women on the House floor, calling out the fact that this institution has been and continues to be a patriarchal one and an institution dominated by masculinity and whiteness, what they do is they intervene. And it doesn't mean that those biases don't still exist, but they unmask them, right? They can't be under the surface. And so I would just say one way to change it is to try and see the value in getting into those positions of power. Because as Tanya noted, when you get into these rooms and you say, nobody else is like me, you know what, I'm gonna check out because I don't wanna be here. This is not a friendly place.
Mhm.
But fortunately, your voice is more needed in those places than ever. And then once you are there and you have that equal level of power, like AOC did to do a floor speech just as much as Ted Yoho, you use the power that you have. And we did a bunch of interviews with women in Congress where they said, sure, you want to be rude to me? I have a vote. My vote is the same as your vote. And so I think finding and not being dissuaded from embracing those and taking your seat at these tables of power.
Yeah, I would just say too, when people learn the Alice Paul story and the story of those women being in jail and force-fed, how horrible, how horrible. But in a way, it's almost easier to fight bold aggression like that. Like for me, sort of the more heart-wrenching part of her story are the next 50 years when she was sidelined and ignored. And that's harder to fight, I think. So sometimes the more direct aggression, and aggression isn't the right word, but the more direct is the easier battle to fight.
Mhm. There's a question that also appeared in the chat. The first half of the question is for the whole panel, and then the second question, Tanya, is just for you. So let's address the first one, which is about internalized misogyny. When women themselves believe that women shouldn't be in power because of the age-old accusation that women are too emotional, they might start wars, even though all wars have not been started by women, or no war has been started by a woman, right? So, first that question: what are some strategies for internalized misogyny, like women not supporting other women? And then there was a question from Tanya too.
Tanya, do you want to take it first, and then we'll work backward?
Yeah, we can definitely do that. So I think that there is like no one solution. I think at the end of the day, it's about listening to one another, and at the it's having that ability to have that compassion for one another. And so I think that oftentimes internalized misogyny comes from the idea of like only seeing women as one thing, but in reality, women make up so many other factors. So for example, like just if we go with the whole like you're a kid. As a kid, there's girls that are girly girls, but there's also tom girls, right? And so I think that having that understanding from like that basic to like understanding of what that was like to having women from then be able to specter out to be different identities and different ideas, like I think having that understanding of how different women can be is really important, and seeing them as individuals and seeing them as people in the same way that they regard as men. So like in terms of like them being too emotional, I think that's oftentimes just a stereotype that's pushed on. And so I think that it's men are emotional too, and it's like the way that we handle it is should not be judged because everyone handles it differently.
I'll just say real quick on the piece about women against women. I get this question a lot when we talk to women candidates, and they're like, women are the worst, women are the ones who are terrible to us. And I just always remind people, and I think this is also true both at the intersections of race and gender, class, remember who is determining the pie, the allocation of power in this pie, right? And has been for all of US history, white men who get to determine who gets this power. And so when they give your group this little slice of power, and then they say, fight amongst yourselves, and then we reinforce it by saying like, it's that other woman who's keeping me down. When we know that the power structure itself is what's doing it, I think we just always have to have that reminder in not as sort of like who's the enemy, but who is controlling the allocation of power beyond these one-on-one interactions. This is not to say that women are certainly sexist. We know that Black and Latino and Native American folks can be racist as well. We know this to be true, but also to remember that there is this larger power structure within which we're all, competing for a voice and access.
Mm-hmm. Lucy or Nicole, did you want to add anything? All right, well, and then Tanya, there was a question for you, and then there's another question about, two questions are sort of related to the ones we just had, but this question for you, Tanya, was about what has your activism journey been like since you were 15, and how have you stayed committed when there's a burnout factor, or sometimes it can be tiring to be an activist?
Right. So essentially, I think the most important thing for me is figuring out how I can help. I see it very much as like a service. How can I really help my community? And so when I first started, I just was like very much just like listening and wanting to know what I can do to help and how I can get involved. And so I've just kept that that mentality as I keep growing and learning and being in different scenarios and situations. But I think that the biggest thing is like, don't be afraid to fail is my biggest like takeaway. I remember when I first had my first like it was like a meeting where I was presenting about like some of the rights that immigrants have in this project we were proposing, and we invited the community to come in, and the only ones that showed up were my two best friends. That was it. I was presenting with a group, I was dressed up, I was super like ready, and that's everyone that showed up. And it was like we were able to reflect, what didn't we do right? How can we get more people involved? How can we get them in the door? And so I honestly learned a lot from that experience, because I went ahead and went through my presentation and I had some stumbles, and I was able to learn how can I better prepare next time. So don't be afraid to fail is a big takeaway. But then in terms of momentum, I totally know how it can take a toll and what that feels like. So when I was 15, I was at the steps of the Supreme Court. We took a bus to go to DC, and we were advocating for DACA extended in DAPA, and it didn't go through in terms of Supreme Court because it was split decision. So I went to the lower court. And then I found myself going back again in 2019 for the DACA decision. And I felt so stuck in time, because it was the fact that we were still on the same subject 4 years later, and we're still talking about DACA today. It takes a toll on me, because I'm doing all this work. I'm trying to do everything I can to really help those in my community, and nothing's really being progressed. And the way that I keep going is just by listening to those in those communities and how much that means to them. Whenever I was in the Supreme Court when I was 15, I was listening to the mothers that were they decided to not eat because they wanted to, it was like a protest. And so I was listening to their stories about why it mattered so much to them and why they really wanted to stay with their kids. And just hearing what their point of view was, how thankful they were that I was doing something, I was trying something, that meant a lot to them. So I think at the end of the day, it's just talking with the people that you're advocating for. That's going to put everything in perspective, to make everything worth it.
Thank you, Tanya. We have two more questions, and I think I'd actually like to ask them in reverse order, because the other question, one of the questions follows up on what we were already talking about, which was women not necessarily supporting other women. And both Lucy and Kelly alluded to this a little bit when you were speaking. Lucy, you pointed out that there was Alice Paul had the sense that women should vote as a bloc, and they should have their own party, and they should vote in their own interests. But that didn't necessarily happen. And then Kelly also made the point that women aren't winning in part because women aren't voting for them. And so I think that's an interesting, I wonder if that is going to give us some insight into this question. And so Lucy, would you speak first, and then Kelly? And then I think I'm a little bit worried we're going to be out of time, but.
Well, I'll just, I want to cede the floor to Kelly. I just want to quick say that I do think this may be changing with this new generation, with AOC and the squad, who are just not falling for that, and who are just staying true to their own beliefs and not playing that game. But I really want to leave it open for others.
I will just say one thing. So just to clarify, women do vote for women. There's not a bias against women, but they don't vote based on gender lines, which I know is what you're saying, but this is always one of those areas. What we need to be cognizant of is certainly women are not monolithic. And part of what the suffrage centennial has given us, I think, is a better opportunity to really grapple with the diversity of women, of their views, of their incentives and motivations in politics. And what that has revealed is a history that is more uncomfortable, especially for white women, to be able to say, yeah, there were white women throughout all of US history, and there continue to be today, who see their racial privilege as much more important than a sense of gender solidarity. And so they have very different views on gender as well. but they certainly see an advantage to maintaining the privilege that comes with their race. And so that informs some of the division that we're seeing and folks are confused about. Like, well, why would you vote for Donald Trump if he said misogynistic things? Well, there are other things that Donald Trump is also advancing that may advance the well-being or security of particular communities of people. And so if we start to at least challenge the idea that women are a monolithic group anyway, then I think we get to better explanations and a much longer answer to this smart question about the differences among women and where this comes from, where the sort of anti-gender, anti-feminist or anti-woman approach comes from.
We're going to have a whole other session. So just to talk about that, right? So there's a panelist that wants to ask a question, and she said she would ask her question, make a comment. I just want to make sure that we don't skip. There's one student that asked a question, which I think is really a question about benevolent sexism. You know, should men, is there something wrong with men protecting women or trying to help them, you know, hold doors for them, or is that sort of an outdated way to think about gender? And so I wonder, I mean, what I'd like to say is that more than opening doors, if men would amplify women's voices, that's probably the thing that would be far more effective. You know, if men are in a room with women and women speak and the men say, as Tanya said, as Lucy said, and amplify those voices, that's probably the way to support women in a way that will make a difference in their lives. And I see the panelists nodding their heads. And so let's have, Marie, will you go ahead and speak?
Sure. Can you hear me now? Okay. So I'm sort of I'm a student of the 70s. I started law school in 1972, and people would sort of laugh and say, "Oh, you're going to be a lady lawyer?" So times have changed somewhat. So I lived through the non-ratification of the ERA, and Lucy, I was particularly pleased with your comments about it. Are there any efforts to reignite the battle to get the ERA ratified?
Absolutely. Another website to see is equalrightsamendment.org. There was a time limit put on its ratification by Congress in 1972. That time limit ran out in 1982, with only 35 states of the required 38 having ratified. It was reintroduced into Congress every session since 1982. In 2000, I'll say 17, the state of Nevada ratified it, became the 36th. The next year, the state of Illinois ratified it, becoming the 37th. And in January of 2020, Virginia State House ratified it. And the move now is to get that time limit negated. So in February of 2020, the US House of Representatives passed a bill with a big margin that removed the time limit. And that would mean that it would get ratified, but that it has to go to the Senate, and you know who, the leader of the Senate, says it will not come up on the House. So the idea now is in January, we start all over with this process.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to add, because I think it's important, I think Maggie Thatcher started the Falklands War. I think that she—
Good point. Yeah, she's right.
Yeah. So
you were watching The Crown this weekend, weren't you?
No, I haven't watched it since the first season. No, I do international research, so I'm not.
You're right.
I dropped out. So
yeah, there haven't been many, but you're right.
Yeah.
Thank you for reminding me. I misspoke. So one woman. So,
yeah, no, it was,
that's right.
We have these international women like Indira Gandhi and Maggie Thatcher that are really sort of brutal women. And so I think that we need to recognize, that they're not, Golda Meir may have started the 6-Day War.
Oh yeah, I better look that up. I'll look it up and I'll stop saying that.
Yeah,
I'll say fewer than 5.
Yeah, there you go. We only have 2 so far. Yeah.
Right.
But it just proves Kelly's point that we're not a monolith.
Right, exactly. Well,
Thanks
I want
all
to
of you. It was great. It was a great panel. I loved it.
thank you, Marie. I am going to, free period's over, and we appreciate your questions. It sounds like we could do this all over again and have a whole follow-up event. There were a couple of questions in the chat. If you're in the Honors College, this event was recorded and there was a list of participants. The Zoom automatically generates a list of participants. So there's no sign-in sheet for that. There is a sign-in sheet, I think, for the History Club, and that's been posted a couple of times on the chat. Alexa, I'm sorry we didn't get to your questions, which were terrific. And we appreciate everyone coming. I hope we can do this again in person next year. And I wish you all a great weekend, and thank you again for coming. And I guess, I don't know how we clap on Zoom, but we can clap for our panelists, right? So, all right.